I am not the first person to say that hourly pricing is going away. Jonathan Stark has been saying that for years. Now, though, it makes even less sense. There's the old joke about there's a factory, the key machine has stopped working. They bring in a consulting engineer and they're like, we're losing millions while this is shut down. And the engineer walks around and gets out a small hammer, taps on the machine, and suddenly everything comes back. And they send a bill and it's 10,000. The factory's like, what 10,000 just for tapping? And it's like, oh, okay, well, here's an itemized bill, right? It was 10 for tapping and 99 for knowing where to tap. Time and materials doesn't convey the value of knowing where to tap.
I'm Harv Nagra. I'm an operations consultant, a former in-house agency operations director, and head of brand communications at Scoro. Welcome to The Handbook, the Agency Operations Podcast, a space where we talk to fellow experts and operations leaders about agency life, discussing the challenges keeping us up at night, as well as strategies that help make things run a little bit smoother. Welcome back to the podcast, all. If you're running an agency, pricing is one of the hardest and most important decisions you'll need to make. Price too low, and you're burning out your team on work that doesn't pay the bills. Price too high, and you're worried about scaring off the client. But beyond the numbers, this is an ops problem, because even with solid pricing on paper, profitability often gets eaten up by misscoped projects, inefficient delivery, or teams constantly reinventing the wheel. So today, we're talking about how to price smarter and build a more profitable agency without compromising on quality or client relationships. Whether you're thinking about shifting to value-based pricing, figuring out how to raise your rates, or just want to plug the holes that are leaking margin, this one's going to be packed with practical advice. Today's guest is Karl Sakas, an agency growth consultant who's worked with hundreds of agencies across 36 countries. For more than 20 years, he's been helping agency leaders go from overwhelmed and reactive to confident and in control. Through his consultancy, Sakas and Company, Karl blends practical frameworks with deep operational know-how, drawing from his background in project management, digital strategy, and operations. I've been following Karl's work for a while now, and he's absolutely brilliant. His site is packed with hundreds of useful articles. His latest book, Calm the Chaos, which I've just read, is full of actionable advice on running a better agency. And I'm not even kidding. Even his out-of-office email delivers value. He's super impressive. I'm so excited to have Karl on the show today. Let's get into it. Karl, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Harv, great to be here. Looking forward to helping people.
Thank you so much. I'd love to start with you telling a bit about your agency background, if you wouldn't mind.
Before becoming an agency advisor, I served in agency operations as a PM, as a director of client services, a director of operations. And if you go way back to the days of dial-up, I was a freelance web designer in high school and college. So I've been in the industry for quite some time.
Amazing. And so when did you branch off and start your own consultancy?
I started what's now Sakas and Company in 2013.
Wow.
I'd worked for one agency and then another as a PM and head of operations. And I realized there was this opportunity where people start agencies because they love the work, not because they necessarily love running a business. And of course, that's where operations will come in. I joke that operations is everything that needs to happen, but that the agency owners don't want to do themselves.
Exactly that. I can definitely relate to those situations where people start an agency because they're great at something, but not because they're great at running a business. And certainly operations is not one of those things people tend to be great at intuitively, perhaps. So there's lots of brilliant things you talk about, Karl, so much that I really had to think about what I wanted to focus the conversation on today. I've settled on what I'm calling pricing, profitability, and predictions. Side note for anyone listening, Karl has a really interesting article about predictions for where the agency space is going to be in the year 2030. So we'll put a link to that in the episode notes so you can go and read that. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground as a result today, Karl. So if you're ready, we can dive in.
Absolutely.
I wanted to start with pricing. There's a few core ways you can price work in your agency, right? There's time and materials, there's deliverable and milestone based, which tends to be quite common. And then there's value-based pricing. Could you walk us through these, covering when they're a good fit and maybe some pros and cons of each of those?
Historically, time and materials can be a good option if you don't know how long something will take, or if you're doing sort of maintenance-y requests for a past client who did maybe a big project and they've scaled back. You're
Right.
charging per hour, or for some agencies by day or half day. Before the rise of AI tools, hourly or time and materials made sense in certain circumstances. If it was the first time you're doing something, or if a client was happy to say, oh yeah, whatever time it takes, get it done. The problem is that time and materials doesn't capture the value of intellectual property, AI tools that you've built internally or that you may be using, and things like that. It also, and even before AI, doesn't capture the value of your experience. For instance, I've worked with over 600 agencies. I do charge more, certainly, than when I had less experience, but being able to solve a problem quickly,
Hmm.
in say a 1 hour call or in a couple month project, that has a lot of value, and time and materials doesn't capture that. And the same is true for agencies. So historically, time and materials was helpful if, you needed that flexibility. Ideally, though, agencies would be doing the second model, deliverable based or fixed scope, fixed price. That can work for projects and for ongoing retainers. It's where the client is paying a flat amount to receive certain deliverables or certain things that they're getting. A lot of agencies, if you're listening and you're doing time and materials, you probably want to move toward deliverable based or
Hmm.
milestone based. The advantage there, of course, is that you're charging a fixed price for a fixed scope. If you can get things done efficiently and effectively faster, you come out ahead.
Hmm.
Of course, it doesn't work if things go way over your plan and you're still on the hook to get things done. It does require some sometimes difficult conversations with clients about scope management.
Right.
Because if a client requests something that's out of scope, you need to say no. Although ideally, you give them options. You could say, for instance, we're glad to do that. Would you like to take care of that next month
Mm.
when we have budget for it? Or would you like to shift some things around this month? Or would you like to potentially add some extra budget and get it all done right now? If your team avoids conflict, that can be a problem with fixed scope. Value based has a few forms, but in its purest form, value based pricing is about charging a percentage of the value the client gets. You could think of it as a commission or a royalty. For instance, if the client gets an extra 5 million in sales and you're charging 10% of that, you're going to get 500,000. And if they get more, you get more. If they get less, you get less. And some agencies will often charge a fixed amount plus a value-based fee on top of that. Value-based pricing is the holy grail for agencies, but often if you're struggling with profitability, you're better off moving from, say, time and materials to fixed price, or if you're in fixed price now, getting better at scoping and scope management rather than going to a totally different model.
Between value-based and performance-based, is there a difference in those pricing models?
They're pretty much synonymous. Some agencies will describe themselves as performance based when they're focusing on client performance, but not necessarily charging based on it.
Mm.
For instance, pay per click oriented agencies, affiliate marketing oriented agencies, they are working to drive performance. They may not necessarily be exactly doing value based pricing.
I mean, the whole value-based pricing thing can feel like a leap for some agencies when they might already be feeling like it's a race to the bottom in terms of competing against everyone else out there. And there's so many agencies in a given niche. We recently had an episode with Max Trailer on how to position yourself as a strategic partner with your clients so you can get out of that race to the bottom. But in your point of view, how do you break through to value-based pricing if you've never done that before?
Max has great advice. So if people haven't seen the episode or checked out his books or materials, definitely want to dig in. A great starting point toward value based pricing without leaving a fixed scope model is to do what I would call value anchoring.
Mm.
That's where you have a conversation with the client about the value you're trying to deliver for them, and then framing your fixed fee as a much smaller percentage of that. For instance, my initial engagement is an 8 to 10 week agency growth diagnostic. It is a fixed price based on the number of stakeholders involved, which
Okay.
tends to be a proxy for the complexity of what all is going on. A particular agency reached out and they're interested in selling the agency, but their valuation now isn't as high as they want it to be in the future. I did some estimates. My sense was the rough valuation was somewhere between 2.5 to 3 million now. They wanted to sell for 8 million or more. And so I said, I can help you do that. It'll take some time. You need direction on where to go and what to prioritize. That's where that initial agency growth diagnostic will help, and then can help them on an ongoing basis toward that goal, or they can do it themselves. In this case, I was able to anchor that they are looking to add something like $5 million in value, and the price of the initial project is a fraction of it. I mean, almost I was thinking, oh, I'm undercharging for this relative to the insights they'll get. Of course, they still have plenty to do. I wouldn't get credit for the whole increase. But for people who are listening, and as you're working with your sales teams as an operations leader, are they having conversations about the value the client is going to get? If you don't have those conversations, you can't value anchor. And if the client isn't clear on what the value is, you can't value anchor. For instance, I had a client as a director of client services that was a cosmetic dentist. They did general and cosmetic dentistry. Their ideal was to sell a smile makeover, which adjusted for inflation would be about $50,000 today. But I introduced them to the concept of lifetime customer value, or for them, lifetime patient value. And I told them about the idea, and I was like, do you have a sense of what that amount is? And they said $4,000. They said, and that's usually in the first 4 to 5 years. After that, we have maxed out their mouth. It's a little terrifying to hear dentists talking about maxing out your mouth, but they got it. So for instance, if I could say, in a month, we had helped them generate 20 new patients who were worth 4,000 apiece, that was 80,000 in value, and they were paying less than that in their retainer, that helped anchor the value. So I would start by value anchoring before you jump directly to value-based pricing or full performance-based pricing. It'll help set the stage.
Is it possible that when you're doing that value anchoring, if you don't attain the results that you were aiming for, does that happen, and how do you avoid that kind of situation?
The idea is that you're doing a relatively small percentage of the total value. If you're doing 10% and they only get half the value, they still paid you 20% of that reduced amount, and they received 80% instead of 90%.
Understood. That makes sense. When you're working with existing clients, agencies that you consult with, are people able to make that transition from fixed price, fixed scope projects to value-based with their existing client base? And if so, what kind of advice do you have to get people to make that transition?
Agencies sometimes can make a transition to value anchoring or even value-based with current clients. A challenge is that your current clients are used to working with your agency in a certain way.
Right.
So if they're used to saying, yeah, we'll get this done, it'll take 3 hours, and you've charged them an hourly rate, and now you're suddenly saying, well, that'll be a percentage of this and a percentage of that. Clients were used to how you're working before. That can be a tough sell. Of course, that can go in other ways. I had a client once who would, anytime he would send a request, he would say, oh, I think that'll take you about an hour. And we did time materials. I was like, well, actually, that'll be 8 hours based on my discussion with the team. It's like, oh, 8 hours. I could have done it myself. And I'm thinking, no, probably not. And well, even if you could, you asked us to do it. So it's 8 hours. So some of those clients who are cheapskates or maybe don't have a good internal focus on the value of their work may not move to it. It's a lot easier to move to value anchoring and higher prices in general with new clients. But you can say to existing clients, I talk about this in an article I wrote for the Shopify partner blog, but applies to any kind of agency about raising your prices. One of the keys is that if you don't raise a particular client's price, make sure they know that other people are paying more. You could say, for instance, as a heads up, new clients are now paying 30% more. We enjoy working with you. You're locked in on a client loyalty discount through the end of the year or something like that. And then maybe at that point, their price goes up 10 or 15% instead of 30%. And they're like, oh, we're getting a good deal. It all depends on the client. It depends on the relationship. It's a lot easier to switch any kind of model or pricing with a brand new client, but you can make it work with current clients if you make it worth their while.
definitely. And I read that article, by the way, really, really excellent advice and examples on how to make that transition with your customers and also being okay with losing certain clients over time as well, I think.
Yes. The key there is, as you saw in the article, it's a portfolio approach to price increases. It
Hmm.
is not that every client gets the exact same increase because they all have different scopes, different histories and goals,
Hmm.
things like that. But the idea is that you're raising the price to the appropriate suitable level. That's going to be higher for some, lower for others, maybe no increase. It also gets into whether you want to keep the client.
Hmm.
I have a concept I call strategic churn. That's where you replace previous or current clients with better new clients. If it's a client you're okay to lose, maybe they're going to get a higher increase if they want to stick around, or a higher increase if they want to keep working with, say, the owner of the agency, where maybe the owner used to work with lots of clients directly, not really anymore.
Yeah.
If clients want to keep working with the owner, they're going to be paying a lot more for
Yeah.
that premium service.
I really, really love that, Carl. And I've never heard anybody put it that way, that if there are customers that you're less happy to work with, kind of
Mhm.
price them out and be okay with that. But also the example of pricing your senior team or certainly your MD or CEO at a much higher rate is so good. Because sometimes that happens where clients are like, I refuse to work with yourselves if I don't get to work with
Mhm.
so and so any longer.
Yeah, well, and you're not forcing them to stop working with the senior person, but now it's like, well, you've been paying 7,000 a month. New clients are now paying 15 to 20. If you want to continue at that price, we'll need to make some changes to the team and the strategists on the account. Or if you're willing to go up to say 12 or 15, we can continue with the current team. Which do you prefer? I call that reason options choose. Give a reason why, give them two or three hand selected options that you've identified, and then let them choose.
Excellent. One of the predictions you had in your article for 2030 is that we're going to see a rise in performance based pricing. Could you just briefly go over again where this works well, if there's certain kinds of scenarios where this kind of model tends to work better?
Performance based pricing works well when the client has a clear idea of their own internal value, the value of a lead, for instance, or a sale if they're doing direct sales and things like that.
Mhm.
They also have good attribution to know that things came from your agency's efforts and ideally from a particular campaign or particular program.
Mm,
The agency is good at doing the work, right? That you can get it done effectively and efficiently. And ultimately, the client trusts you because there's a risk if you're adding a performance based component. Is the client going to be truthful in the results they got to make sure that you're getting paid?
right.
Usually they are. I mean, because ultimately they're making way more money
Mm,
than the money they're paying you. But when it comes to risk management, I recommend looking at three things. One, what is most likely to happen? If it's likely to happen, you should have a plan for it. What is not likely to happen, but would be catastrophic if it did? I
right.
mean, that's why people get homeowners insurance or renters insurance or things like that, where like your house probably isn't going to burn down, but if it did, it would be really bad. And
Hmm.
you want the insurance coverage. The third thing, though, to look at, so what's most likely to happen, what would be catastrophic, unlikely to be catastrophic. The third thing is, what if it goes really well? What if things go beyond your wildest dreams? And in that case, they might be paying you millions
Hmm.
in performance-based fees. Are they setting aside the money?
Right.
Are you set up to receive those payments?
Yeah.
Is your bank going to think that you're receiving some sort of money laundering payments or something like suddenly getting all of this money? I would give your banker a heads up if you're about to get a sudden million or multi-million wire transfer. The thing though is that if they're paying you somehow millions in performance fees, it's because they're making likely 10 or 20
Right.
or 30 million themselves. So are they ready for that
Hmm.
themselves? Is the client able to fulfill that?
Yeah.
All these things to consider.
Is that just a conversation to make sure that they're set up for that? Or is there anything else that you can do to make sure that's all in place?
Ideally, you're running some sort of attribution process or system so that, and you have access to their CRM or their sales system or things like that. I mean, it's easy in e-commerce where you're able to track pretty closely
Hmm.
where a particular sale came from. If they are getting phone inquiries, you'll need to work with their team to make sure that they're recording where the inquiries came from and things like that. With the dentist office example, we did some training with the office staff about how to log things when new patients came in, and actually were able to get a new field added into their internal CRM. But that does raise, if you're questioning the ethics of a client, you definitely don't want to do a performance-based deal with them.
Absolutely. Good point. So, what makes you confident that this is going to become more common and prevalent in the next few years?
It's all about incentive alignment, right?
Mm.
Your clients want to grow, whether that's selling more services or products or reaching other goals of their own. Maybe they're growing to have an exit or something like that. The more you can tie what you do to what they want,
Hmm.
the better aligned you are toward their goals. And performance-based pricing can be a way to create that incentive alignment in a way that the traditional models of time and materials and milestone-based don't in the same way.
That kind of leads us to my next question, which was another kind of bold claim that you've made is that time and materials pricing is going to disappear by 2030. So, what makes you think that is going to be completely on its way out?
I am not the first person to say that hourly pricing is going away. Jonathan Stark has been saying that for years. Until the rise of AI, though, I was more agnostic about time and materials in
Right.
the sense that, well, if you haven't done the work before, if the client's happy with the model, that can be fine.
Hmm.
Now, though, it makes even less sense. It goes from neutral for time and materials to a negative is if you can solve all of their problems in an hour, it's probably worth more to them than what they paid for that hour. There's the old joke about there's a factory, the key machine has stopped working. They bring in a consulting engineer and they're like, we're losing millions while this is shut down. And the engineer walks around and looks at a few things, makes some measurements, gets out a small hammer, taps on the machine, and suddenly everything comes back. And they send a bill and it's 10,000 or something like that. And the factory's like, what 10,000 just for tapping? And it's like, oh, okay, well, here's an itemized bill,
Mm.
right? It was 10 for tapping and 99.90 or what have you for knowing where to tap.
Right.
Time and materials doesn't convey the value of knowing where to tap.
Really good point. And it brings us back to what you were saying earlier with AI and kind of recent conversations we've had on the podcast as well is that if these tools make us more efficient, we should not be passing on all those savings in time and efficiency onto the client.
There's
And
even an opportunity to potentially charge more if you can get it done in a shorter duration. You can get things turned around
Mhm.
faster. I mean, people pay for convenience. If you think about baby carrots versus regular carrots, like you pay more per pound for the baby carrots, but they're pre-peeled, they're pre-washed, they're
Yeah.
they're ready to eat. Labor has value and you pay for convenience.
So, Carl, let's talk about price reviews then. Are there any good rules of thumb about how often you should be reviewing and adjusting your pricing?
I would review your pricing at least once a year.
Hmm.
And that's looking at what you're charging new clients as well as what you're charging existing clients. As I
Hmm.
mentioned with existing clients, it's going to be a portfolio of prices. Not everyone is necessarily at the exact same price because everyone's in a somewhat different situation. But ultimately, you would likely raise prices for new clients and then do that portfolio approach of different increases for existing clients. I
Hmm.
probably do that once a year. You may conclude that you don't need to raise prices. Though there is value to doing some sort of even a modest increase every year so that clients are used to it, as opposed to suddenly they're like, oh, it went up 15%. And it's like, if you had done 3 or 5% a few years in a row,
Right.
you would have been closer to that in an easier to digest way.
Really good point, and a great opportunity right now to mention again that article on raising prices that we'll put in the episode notes. I really think that there's a lot of value to be gained by reading that. But should you be afraid to lose clients over your pricing? What are your thoughts?
If it's a client that you want to, as I would say, strategically churn,
Right.
give them a higher price if they want to renew, or a higher price if they want to keep working with the owner or the senior most team members. On the other hand, if it is a client where you feel like you can't afford to lose them, sometimes that's the case where if you have a client concentration problem, which I define as getting 20% or more from a single client.
Okay.
And for those listening, I was speaking with an agency COO. I was talking about the idea of client concentration. Her goal was to bring me in to help. And, I'd mentioned the 20%, and you can't, be like, well, that's a different department of this company. And it's funny, she'd been trying to get her bosses to understand that different departments don't matter. It's all about the company. I'm like, well, you can say that I said it, right? I've worked with 600 agencies. Carl says 20% from the company, no matter the department, that's a client concentration problem. If you're concerned that the client would just go away, then you may not press as hard.
Right.
But I would at least let them know, even if they don't have an increase, that new clients are paying more, they're getting a client loyalty discount, and tip, put that discount into every invoice they get, every auto draft receipt they get, and things like that. Because if your client contact leaves and a new person comes in, they don't see that they're getting a special deal. They'll assume it is a normal deal. Whereas if they're like, oh, they're getting a 10% discount every month, they may still expect some sort of deal, but at least they can't claim they had no idea.
Exactly. And it's funny how quickly clients, even the clients that you've been working with a lot for a long time, easily forget that they have that discount if you're not spelling it out on that invoice every single time. Now, about that 20% rule that you were mentioning, is that all about risk and mitigating that if that client were to disappear? What's your point of view on that?
So the idea of client concentration is that if you become overly dependent on any one client, if you lose them as a client, you're probably going to have to do layoffs. I spoke with an agency where they had about 40% of their revenue from one client. They were a long-time client. They also weren't incrementally a very profitable client. Like the overall profits were good because they were a big client, but they were at the lowest rate that the agency was charging because the client had been around for a while. They're getting volume discounts. The agency hadn't been raising prices. So if you lose a 40% client, you're going to have to do layoffs.
Right.
You're going to have to make some really difficult cuts. The other thing is maybe the client doesn't fire you, but you want to fire them. You're going to feel trapped because you can't suddenly easily lose 40% of your revenue without doing layoffs and owners cutting their pay and things like that. So the goal is to avoid getting trapped in a situation where you couldn't afford to lose them if they initiated, or where you feel like you can't afford to cut ties with them if it's at that point.
So we're going to shift gears a touch, and I wanted to pick your brain about profitability. Besides sales pipeline anxiety, profit tends to be something I hear a lot of agencies worrying about. What are the key levers that can be pulled to improve margins?
The biggest overarching driver for your margins is your labor ratio. What
Okay.
percentage of your revenue are you spending on team members? But if we're setting aside changes to your team, we can look at delivery profitability, and there are three levers there.
Okay.
First is pricing, second is scope, and the third is scope management. Here's an example. I was working with an agency in Austin, Texas several years ago, where the owner said, I've been running my firm for a decade. I thought I'd be making more money at this point and that I wouldn't be working quite as hard. That was before I had released my Work Less, Earn More book, but she definitely was in the target audience for that. And so I dug in using what's now the agency growth diagnostic, and I found a series of problems. She was undercharging, she was delivering too much scope, and her team was not managing the scope very well. She did not want to make any changes to her team. I was working with her and her director of operations. I said, well, here are the three levers. Right now, you're charging about half of what similar agencies would charge for this type of work. Ideally, you would raise prices, starting with new clients and perhaps transitioning part of the way there for existing clients. Her response, remember, she's working too much and not making enough.
Right.
She's like, oh, my clients could never pay that much. I can't raise their prices. I'm like, I mean, I'm thinking some of her clients were smaller, but I think others would have been willing to pay more. And she could also potentially look at somewhat, instead of micro businesses, smaller businesses as an option, but she didn't want to do that. I said, okay, you could also reduce the scope of what you're providing. For instance, she was selling, and her team were selling a package that was a brand identity package, a website, and all of the copywriting for the website for what other agencies would charge just for a website
Oh,
or
wow.
just for brand package. I
Hmm.
said, what if you set aside the copywriting as an add-on where they didn't get it automatically, but they could add it for an additional price. She's like, but then the website would have bad copywriting. Okay, but I'm thinking if the client's not paying for it,
Right.
why are they getting it for free? I
Yeah.
said also, or you could say maybe it's the website and the copywriting, but the brand identity package is separate, and that's a first step for them to
Yeah.
do. She's like, well, if they don't do that, then it's going to have a bad brand, and I don't want that to be in our portfolio. I'm thinking like if you can't convince clients to pay for value, you're not going to make more money. I said, well, there's a third lever, right? I'm talking with her and her director of operations. And I said, based on my calculations, they were regularly going over scope by about 80%. Clients
Wow.
were getting almost double of the scope. And I said, going forward, you can stop going over scope. The team will have to be more firm about what is and isn't in scope, charging for scope creep and things like that. And the operations director said, how over scope can we go?
Oh dear.
And I'm thinking, how much money do you want to lose?
Yeah.
That was actually a case where I recommended stopping the project halfway through, refunding the rest of the project because they didn't seem to want to make changes.
Mm.
And I laid that out as a boundary, and they were like, no, 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 we want to follow it. And I foolishly believed them. And
Hmm.
we kept going, and I don't think they made changes. So I had some new things to keep in mind for my screening process.
That's interesting. Where does that mentality come from? They seem to be wanting to run a design charity or something like that, where they're giving away.
Yeah, yeah. I've started in my intake process. I'll ask clients about what is their relationship with money.
Hmm.
Are there some things from their childhood that are still showing up now
Interesting.
they're getting them in trouble? I think in her case, it was around seeing the idea of like money or having money as bad. And
Hmm.
so she was inadvertently making choices that undermined
Wow.
her making money.
Hmm.
Another client I'm working with, they mentioned they were often overloaded with client requests and things like that, and tons of Slack messages. And what emerged is that part of their value proposition is that clients get direct Slack access to the agency team, which is not a good idea. And the team is getting overwhelmed. And one of the things that I've noted is like, you got to stop doing that. And the agency owner is like, well, that's really important. That's why people hire us. And I'm
Mm.
like, yeah, that's why they hire you because no one else is doing that, or very few are doing that. If they are, they're charging 2 or 3 times as much per month for
Mm.
retainers. As I'm finalizing my advice for them is stop doing it or charge way more. Pick which you want, and
Yeah.
then you can make it happen.
Hmm.
I have a book recommendation, which is Overcoming Under-Earning
Okay.
by Barbara Stanny. It's
Mm.
focused mostly on people who are in salaried roles of like how to negotiate getting more money, getting what you're worth. It does work for owners. For instance, I recommended it to a client several years ago where as soon as she read it, she reported back that she'd raised her salary like 50%, that she was underpaying herself. It
Hmm.
also works overcoming under earning on charging more for your services. You're like, okay, it's worth it. People need to pay for it, or at least certainly new clients need to pay for it, and you'll work on increasing. So overcoming under earning.
Excellent. Do you see any kind of common ways agencies lose money without realizing it? And how can they stop that if that's the case?
Cool. I've written a whole article on profit leaks,
Okay.
right? And how things can go wrong. I would say as a starting point, look at your net profit margins. If your net profit margins are 20 to 30% after market rate owner compensation, you're probably doing fine. On the other hand, if your net margins are 10 or 15% or less, client came in recently where they were in the single digits, you want to dig into why. Overspending on labor can be a big factor, especially if you have a slower than projected year. You've got the team that you expected if it was a bigger year, and you don't make any staffing changes. That can be a big factor. But I would start by looking at what are your net profit margins. If it's below 20%,
Hmm.
you've got profit leaks somewhere. It could be staff, it could be how the team is logging their time, it could be something else. But as an operations leader, that's a sign to dig deeper.
Good advice. Carl, we're going to come back to predictions. There's a lot of change and experimentation with AI. You have
Yeah.
some strong points of view on how we can use these technologies and the efficiencies they bring to our advantage. Something that you've said is don't just use AI to be more efficient, package it as a new high margin service. So that I think is fantastic advice, but I'd love to hear what that looks like in practice.
That's going to be unique to each agency and your clients,
Hmm.
but I would start by looking at what are your clients trying to accomplish, both professionally and personally. I ran a CMO networking group for 5 years. I was the only non CMO in the room. And because I only work with agencies, I had nothing to sell them, right?
Hmm.
Because they weren't my target market. And there were themes that came up around attribution that kept coming up. So it's like, what can your agency do attribution wise? What could you do to coach your clients on it? Where maybe they're using AI tools and you're helping them sort through customization at their firm. Maybe you're building custom GPTs or agentic AI type agents for the client, and then they're running it or something like that, or you're helping maintain. You could be building out tools or you could be providing services. It's going to depend on what your clients need.
Hmm.
I mentioned the personal goals piece. Is the CMO trying to get promoted to become the CEO?
Right.
How can you position yourself to get there? That could be AI related. It might not. I had a client years ago where they were a marketing manager at a large corporation and they had an associate's degree and they were going back part time to get their bachelor's degree.
Hmm.
And I would ask, like, what classes were they taking that semester? Because then I could tie the work that we were doing and upsell opportunities to their classes. And so it created a win win.
Hmm.
So the exact solutions are going to depend on your clients and also on your agency's skill set. On the other hand, if people are listening and they're like AI, more, more of that, or the owners of the agency where you work are like AI, do we really have to? That could be a sign that it may be time for the owners to sell the business and move on rather than keep running it. Like things are going to keep changing. That's not going to stop. And if an owner is tired of dealing with that, it may be a sign that it's time to sell the agency and move on. I will say I ran a workshop and then now it's available on demand, training on control and maximize your agency exit.
Hmm.
And for live attendees, I asked, these were all agency owners of independent agencies, under 100 people, what would they ideally do after they sell their agency? And about half of the respondents said they would start a new business.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, if you're noticing that your boss doesn't seem fully engaged in the business anymore, maybe it's time for them to sell. And by the way, that's an opportunity for you to move up. Maybe it's to move up to become the CEO if you want, or
Hmm.
managing director or something like. There are probably some opportunities there, but it starts by having that conversation. Call out what you've noticed and see how you can help them.
Interesting. One of your kind of related predictions on AI was also that while clients may push back on implementation costs, they'll increasingly pay for expert strategic insights to make sense of AI generated data and
Yeah.
marketing noise. Another prediction was agencies that package AI driven execution with deep human expertise will thrive. Can you
Yeah.
unpack those a little bit?
So think about your services. Agency services fit into three main categories. I think of it as think, teach, do. Think is strategy. Tell me what to do. Teach is training and empowerment, where the client's like, I want to do it myself.
Hmm.
Show me how, or
Hmm.
maybe help me hire people to do it. And then think, teach, do. Do is about implementation. It's about implementing the work. So think about your agency's work. What could you use AI tools, including building things internally, whether that's building custom GPTs, building AI agent related tools, things like that, or using off the shelf tools. What can you do for implementation there? But it still needs to be guided by human strategic insight, though probably strategists that are assisted by AI as well,
Hmm.
right? Feeding in all of the data is a great, into an AI tool can be a great way to get a summary of things, notice things you missed and things like that. But at least at this point, we still benefit from human involvement. So the idea there is that you're selling human insights with AI support and assistance. and you make money doing it.
And this is a fantastic time and opportunity to really get ahead of the competition as well. If you really lean into this, using these tools to your advantage and becoming that strategic partner.
And also, I mean, I'd say I'm sort of intermediate on AI at this point. There are events and programs and people where you can learn from them. I'm helping organize the AI in your agency event in August of 2025
Amazing.
in San Francisco. I went to the first one as an attendee 2 years ago. I recommended it to clients last year. This is through the Bureau of Digital, or the Bureau, where I'm involved as a member. The speakers there are super plugged into what's going on. It's about AI in your operations and AI in your services. So I know that I'm going to learn a lot. I learned a lot before, and now I'm
Right.
going to learn even more. You don't have to invent it all from scratch.
Yeah, really good point. Just make sure you're plugged into those networks and those groups, having those conversations, and learn as much as you can.
Yeah.
Karl, if you had to give one piece of kind of parting advice to an agency ops leader, does anything come to mind?
Make sure you understand the unique values, goals, and resources, VGR, to follow. Usually that'll involve speaking with the owner or owners of the agency. Values would be around how should you approach things? How do you approach work? Goals around where to go, understanding their goals, ideally both professionally and personally, so that you can support them on that. And then the resources in terms of time, money, people, software, things like that to get things done. The more you know about that, the more you can help your boss or bosses achieve their goals. And ideally, that'll help you with your goals as well. So understand where you're going, how they want you to get there within reason, and the resources available. It'll go a lot better for everyone involved.
Really good advice. I mentioned your latest book in the intro, Calm the Chaos, which has just come out. I had the pleasure
Yeah.
of reading. Fantastic. There it is on screen. But you've written a number of books as well, haven't you, Karl? And I think relevant to today's discussion might be Work Less, Earn More, which you were showing us a few moments ago. Could
Yeah.
you briefly tell us what we can find in each?
Yeah, well, Work Less, Earn More, my third book, looks at helping owners, as the subtitle says, escape the daily grind of agency ownership. It works whether you are looking to sell your agency, to have an equity event. Lately, clients are saying they want to sell for 5 to 10 million, though I have some clients who are on track to sell, say, 40 million. Another client is seeking 100 million as their exit. It's going to be a bit further out. Or if you want to run a highly profitable lifestyle agency where you're making above market salary, great profit margins, things are running smoothly, you're doing the work you want. That's the idea of Work Less, Earn More, making yourself increasingly optional as an agency owner. But for everyone who's listening as an operations leader, part of that is the owner is rewarding their best team members,
Right.
which are opportunities for you to move up. For instance, I have a client where the owner wanted to step back. And 5 years ago, we built an initial succession plan and had a key team member who was very promising. So steps to move up: account manager, director of client services, VP, president. And earlier this year, the employee just got promoted to CEO, and the owner is working just a few hours a week at
Amazing.
this point. Yeah. So Work Less, Earn More for the owners, yes, but while rewarding the best team members, that's an opportunity for operations leaders to get promoted, to get new responsibilities, more pay, both now and potentially with phantom stock if they're heading toward an exit. That's Work Less, Earn More. You can go to worklessearnmorebook.com. You can get all of the Amazon links. It's available on Amazon worldwide, different formats, print, Kindle, and an audiobook. The most recent book, Calm the Chaos, which just came out this year in 2025, and you can get the links for that at calmthechaos.xyz. That takes a lot of the lessons from Work Less, Earn More and focuses on leadership and management. It's Calm the Chaos, 10 Ways to Run a Better Agency. Is really about leading people, about delegating, about building a great team, about giving people a chance, but not too long, and also about improving meetings. I've kept it intentionally short. It's about 100 pages, or if you listen to the audiobook, I narrated it's about a little under 2.5 hours, and you can learn more at calmthechaos.xyz.
Excellent. We'll include that in the episode notes. And like I said, it's an excellent book. I really enjoyed reading it. Karl, where can people go learn more about you and reach out?
Feel free to go to my main website, which is sakasandcompany.com. That's SAKASAND, the word company.com. Or if you go to either of the book sites, it'll get you there as well. There are hundreds of articles on agency growth, management, and operations. Some of my clients joke that I have an article for everything. I mean, it's approaching 500 articles, but I still have a few hundred article drafts.
Yeah.
Develop into future articles. There's always more to come, and also a newsletter. Like if you want to get helpful tips twice a week that more than one agency owner has described as the only email they read every time.
Amazing.
So that's all at sakasandcompany.com. Click on free resources and you can get everything.
And I can confirm an article for everything because I went down that rabbit hole a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
Karl, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good luck, everyone.
Well, there we have it, a masterclass on pricing, profitability, and what the future might hold for agencies. The biggest takeaway for me, pricing isn't just a finance decision, it's an operations strategy. From moving away from time and materials to using value anchoring as a stepping stone to value-based pricing, from packaging AI into high-margin services to being more intentional about how and how often you review your rates. It's clear that if agencies want to grow and stay profitable, they need to be braver, sharper, and more strategic in how they price and deliver their work. And I really appreciated Karl's reminder that not all clients are worth keeping. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for your business is to price out the ones that are holding you back. It's not the first time we've heard that advice on this podcast. So if this episode struck a chord, maybe you're undercharging, overservicing, or still stuck on hourly, now is the time to rethink your model. If you have any follow-up questions from this episode that you'd like me to put to Karl, drop me a note at podcast@skoro.com. Lastly, if you've enjoyed today's episode, 3 actions for you. Please share the episode with someone who would enjoy the conversation. Please join the conversation when you see me talking about this episode on LinkedIn, and subscribe to the Handbook Operations newsletter by going to skoro.com/podcast. The newsletter sign-up form is at the bottom of the page. We send out a newsletter every other week with the key takeaways from the episode, so you have a cheat sheet in your inbox. That's it for me for now. Thanks very much for listening. This podcast is brought to you by Skoro, a platform designed for agencies and consultancies, which allows you to manage your projects, finances, and resources, all from one system. This is a platform I brought in at a previous workplace, which completely transformed the way we worked, and which I've recommended to clients of my own. You can sign up for a free trial on skoro.com. That's SCORO.com. Or reach out to me, Harv Nagra, on LinkedIn if you'd like to hear about some of my experiences.